It's hard to believe we've just reached our 200th video. I had a very nice comment from someone who had actually gifted us, the studio, with some books of the type that my students read. And I appreciated the comment in that this person was saying that they appreciated hearing these, having the sort of the world, this world uh, in their lives during this period of craziness. So I'm very pleased that this is playing that role. Wasn't what even a little what I anticipated when we started, but I want to thank Mary Jo also for another contribution. Thank you, Mary Jo. That was excellent, very kind. And of all the things to sort of start out the number 200 with, Mishra, and I do hope I have that name right. I can't remember that that's what it said. We would love to hear your thoughts on narrative painting. Yes, that's very funny because I do everything I can to actually get you to focus on what this form is. And but every painting has a narrative if you're representational painting. It doesn't make any difference what the pile of junk is. There's a narrative presumed, but it's not necessarily presumed that the artist intended for it to be such and such a narrative. But it'll take on that look of, oh, this looks like a pile of junk in the corner of a studio. Oh, this looks like an attic floor. It looks like and you know what I mean? And that begins to be the narrative. But I want to bring you to the the first bunch of pictures that I use when I do a composition workshop, and I cover the subject, would you believe, of narrative. And so, and again, that's, you could say that's subject. In one sense, theme, although theme is interesting, and you'll say people like Whistler doing nocturnes, or using other phrases that have a bit of a musical tendency. So they started naming them after not the physical subject matter like kings and princes, but after the musical subject matter, which is in the video I showed you last week. I call that one amber and green, and our studies are whatever in amber and green, variations in amber and green. That sounds again like a musical subject, and for me that is subject. But the narrative thing, the storytelling element of pictures is always there. So, and it's not the cleverest thing in the world to ignore it. So the subject here, this is Raphael, and the subject is good and evil. Basically, it's Saint George or some other character and the dragon, and the dragon seems to always represent that those forces of evil, the Satan figure, and that sort of thing. So there it is, out in the landscape, maybe saving the woman who could represent the human race or whatever from disaster. There appears to be perhaps a church. I'm not looking closely at these things. So you can understand these are basically religious paintings, given that if that's the title. So, and so everyone knows one of the great paintings of all time is the Entombment of Christ. And so this would be the Joseph of Arimathea giving his tomb to for the use of the family, putting the body of Christ in. So you have the Mary figures, perhaps the disciples and others. So that's pretty. If you're conversant with the Christian faith, you understand that one. Subject. One of the problems of subject, of course, is that they can be difficult to understand if you're not part of that culture. I wouldn't have a clue what's happening in certain pictures from Eastern religions, and even this one here, which is apparently something about the search for the Holy Grail, maybe a clue or something or other. And there's more detail actually written about this by Poussin, but frankly, most people aren't going to, most viewers aren't going to necessarily go in and dig up the subject matter before they buy the picture, although they might, but they're going to say, this is beautiful to look at, and they're going to buy it because of what it does to their walls. It's more about that later. And so this is, again, another Titian, and this is Mars and Venus. And there's that famous story, and this appears, whatever this is up here, by the way, there's the Quetzalcoatl story. Many cultures have this. If you want a really fascinating read, Worlds in Collision by Velikovsky. It's a fascinating read about why the Mars and Venus story is so dominant. But there was an event in the skies with the appearance of Venus for the first time, appearing sort of out of the area of Jupiter in the sky, and then coming into a serious conflict out there with coming, very close to Mars and causing enormous lights and all sorts of stuff in the sky around them. The appearances of explosions and enough that it alarmed every culture in the world. It's just read Velikovsky. It's a fascinating read. Really reorients you. And he's got so many pieces of information, so many documents. It's fascinating to read. Why am I taking you there? This is, I think, the same theme, Mars and Venus, and this would be, I think, Veronese. And so you can see variations on the same themes that were coming up. So you had, if you're coming back, the Renaissance was the return to the Greek ideals, and but also to some of the Greek subjects. So the gods, so to speak, of the Greeks. So there's Rubens. I'm always amused by this subject matter. Here's the princess or whatever bathing, and here's her having her hair done, and this court figure comes in, and he's carrying something, so it could be a telegram, so to speak. It's a note. She glances over, the dog's barking because this kid is intruding, or this person is intruding. But he's reaching out and handing her that, in this whole situation. So there's a whole story surrounding that, almost an anecdote, right? As opposed, a lot of painting, the subject is just a moment, right? A moment just before something terrible happens or whatever. And this is also just a moment, but you can sort of fill in all the details in almost a linear way. Another one of the Greek things, when you get back to the Neo-Greeks, what are you going to call the Latents, the subject, many people were reverting back. They were either going to the Orientalist subject, the subjects of the Near East, or they're going to the Greeks for their subject. This is the Winding of the Skein by Leighton. So again, the Greek subject matter, and you're going to have to look up your Greek mythology. Gamble had a really nice one that he recommended. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember it. I'm not really coming back with it. But there are a number of pretty good Greek mythology books. So here's the I believe this is from a Boccaccio poem in which the jealous husband comes in and murders these two people with a single thrust of the spear, of the sword. Sword probably is the wrong word for that, but again, simple subject in that moment right before the murder, the sweet love and blah, 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 She obviously had married some older guy, maybe by force, maybe she's part of a different kingdom they're trying to get married to get these two kingdoms bonded to each other in some way. Old school stuff, huh? Maybe not so much. Again, now, one of the great designers of all time, of course, is Jerome, and the subject here is the Roman Colosseum, so it's actually going to Rome instead of the Greeks. And so these are the gladiators, and this is that famous question of the thumbs down, thumbs up. The gladiator is looking for permission to, or for whatever, to either take the guy out or let him live. And so you can see thumbs up, thumbs down, that whole thing. And again, that's one of those skills, finding that most expressive moment, And this is the death of Caesar, one of Jerome's most intriguing designs. As I said, he's one of the consummate designers. I don't know if anybody's ever designed more, in some combination, more visually and more in consult with the ancient design ideas, which is more object related. But as you can see, the murder has taken place. Here's the body, and the question is this Brutus or is this one of his other friends who didn't help or didn't murder him but didn't let it go? So, but that death of Caesar, yeah, murder of Caesar, you could say, you know, and then the Richelieu theme, you know, the Cardinal Richelieu was this dominating figure in one of the reigns of one of the Louis in France, as I understand it. And this is another one of those remarkably excellent compositions, and very effective in its narrative. You know, these guys all obviously having to bow to this guy. The distance between them, by the way, I mentioned before, is apparently not just related to their fear of him, but it's also, and his position in a sense, but it's also that he had a terrible skin disease and smelled terrible. So there's the, the shearing of the sheep, the sort of pastoral subject. Millet was a big fan of Virgil. And so the pastoral is, you know, and you should read Virgil actually in the simplicity of it's remarkable. But you can see that he was imbued with that, and of course between that and the scriptures, Millet found his subject typically. The sower is the typical one. And of course coming back to the N.C. Wyeth diary. Now, of course, when you're talking narrative, of course the illustrators, that's their cup of tea, right? The rest of us, we can take it or leave it, or that is to say, may have other primary motives. But these guys, the primary motive is really effectually telling the story. There isn't a better Paul Revere warning the people than this one. There are quite a number of them. But this is really, you know, just in fact, the suspension of the horse in the air really suspends you. It causes this enormous sense of suspension. You know, it's just like you're waiting for the foot to come down again. You can imagine that you can hear the galloping of the feet. But that's the subject again. Narrative. Yeah. Before the coming of the British are coming was the line, right? For anyone who knows American history, if you don't know it, there again, that's where the subject could be a warning about anything, right? You're receiving warning. So, yeah. How does that go? You know, if you have to be able to understand the story to appreciate the picture, it's probably not a good picture. That's one of those interesting points you make when you talk about narrative. Here's a similar theme from N.C. Wyeth, but this guy's got an axe, so this has that look of maybe being Celtic. And I apologize for forgetting to read that. That was one of my great faults in history. It's not history meaning my time with Gamble. It would get so perturbed that I wouldn't come in with the title and the date and all the rest of that stuff of the pictures I was looking at. And it would be almost like I'd be saying, you remember that Thar, you know, N.C. Wyeth, you know, that we saw someplace, you know, as young people, it's very easy to be, to generalize vague, what do you call the fuzzy thinking and the fuzzy expressions. They go hand in hand. But another one of those things, this is a guy's playing the music, maybe for a depressed, I'm guessing wife or boyfriend. And he's not going to have any of it, so there it goes. And some of these themes are so simple. Of course, the Mary Cassatt. This theme has got that really quiet quality that's very like a lot of the Japanese. You know, they're silent, and it's a very, very, very brief moment and very quiet moment where she's obviously filling, or is she licking an envelope? But having just written her note, perhaps a love note. So very simple, though. It gets you much more in the category of what Revere does. And now I'm going to take you down another road and covering the territory in a little bit broader way. So even in a landscape, of course, there's a subject, but this is a very specific one, almost more like an illustrator. You know, there's a salmon rising, and this guy's got his hook, and he's going to snag the salmon. A New England subject, right? This is by Benson. Now, this is what I was saying before, but this is so much like the Mary Cassatt. The Reverie theme, of course, by Tarbell is very common, but this idea here, this is very much like the Mary Cassatt, isn't it? Extremely quiet, a very, very brief moment that has this pause in it. is built in, but it's not some big long dramatic story. Although you could make more out of it if you wanted to by looking at the map and some of the stuff in the room, what she's wearing, whatever. I mean, that question is whether she's pregnant or not, and that sort of thing. But the subject is very limited, isn't it? And so we're saying simply that you don't have to have this big exotic subject. And the reverie, the moment of thought, pensiveness, the pensive, is a very classic thing. The still life, of course, is one of those things that you pile the stuff in because, in this case, it looks like game, and then there's this item of fruit, so it begins to look like you're headed toward the meal that's about to be prepared. And I know that oranges and certain kinds of duck, and this is a pheasant. Not that I know more specifically about rabbit and oranges, but those sorts of things may go together in terms of what the meal is. Yeah, this one though has this feeling, what we call the kitchen table model. It has that feeling of being, I was told this would show better on this thing. That's funny. It doesn't show up today, so I probably still haven't done the right thing with my arrows. But these are both Chardin, for those who didn't realize. And this one, I believe, is the one in the Museum of Fine Arts. A real model, though, of sort of the curious things you can do in design. Yeah, so there's a chunk of meat here, a pot that is going to be boiled in. So it very quickly turns into a story. Maybe something, there's some grinding going on of what, the salt, peppers, whatever that's going to go in, and so on. And this, I don't know, this even looks like another critter, but is that another, yeah, it looks like a bird or something. So who knows what's going on. It's a pile of stuff. Yeah. But it does have all that kitchen sort of related stuff. This is one I'd sent out recently. That's something I'm not quite finished with. I see that I have a problem with a vertical right here. That's one of those things, by the way, that you don't always pick up when you're painting. You might very well miss that, and reducing a picture in size really helps. But that vertical shouldn't be there. I mean, it's a coincidence of the shapes and the combination of things, but I never picked it up, oddly enough. So probably that shape will need to grow or whatever. But anyway, it's interesting to notice that, isn't it? But this is somebody, one of my wonderful clients had this big old pot, and I think I've seen them in use in China or maybe Japan for goldfish. So they fill it up with water, and these goldfish swim around. Pretty good-sized carps can swim in that. So it's probably three plus feet across. But again, what's the subject of the picture, right? I mean, look around. It could be junk in the corner of a studio or an attic, or maybe more likely well, I wouldn't even say what's more likely, but it's piles of junk, right? There's a window here, but none of it looks very fine. It definitely is a storage type of space. So a couple items of furniture, Japanese furniture, and some stuff, mostly in the direction of feeling like it belongs to the Oriental world. This obviously doesn't. This is a tapestry or rug, whatever it is, of a different origin. But then here's one of my students. This is John Peterson. But you can see that the theme, what, a paint can with some junk in it, and an empty water bottle from the old days, the glass types. The picture, music happens. One of the things that people don't realize when you're setting up a still life, frequently things happen. I don't know how many times I walked into a room and a student had some stuff set up that they were thinking about, and not that they were setting up much of a still life, but they didn't know to stop there and realize that they already had music. And that's one of those things about nature's of a landscape. You go out there and find the music. But what is the subject of that? So it's a paint can. What on a what? This could imply a concrete surface, but what with a drape behind it and whatever. Good luck with finding it. But it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't need it. Doesn't need it anymore. This explosion visually tells the entire story. That's one of the beauties of the illustration. I mean, of the subject that isn't narrative in the very, very limited way. But there you'll find a narrative. Now, one of the things that painting does, and all of the arts do, is there's often, if you want to say, an allegory involved. And although it was a funny thing to have, Samuel Johnson said, I'd rather have the portrait of a dog I know than all the allegories in the world. But there's something about the allegory that's fascinating, and I don't think that this is necessarily precisely what what Millet had in mind. But I do, but it may have been because Virgil does things that are, if I'm remembering my Virgil, that really hark back to this. And the idea, though, is that it's the river, it's the water and the life on the water. So here's the traveling on the water, and there's the animals coming down to drink from the water, and here's the women washing the clothes on the water, and the tree surviving on the water. You know what I mean? So there's the life of the water, and so there's this grander theme, which could easily be then turned into an allegory of life, if you want to call it that way. But minimally, it's a poem of water. It's a water theme. So, and on the other hand, this is the theme of the struggle. This is Michelangelo, and it's really the classic theme of men. The struggle simply to survive, but the struggle beyond that. And so I often admired this because of the enormity of this. I mean, it's such a great application. This mass of muscle. This guy's got the enormous musculature that he's trying to break out of the stone, and it's one of those things that rather describes the human. So much potential, and yet so much resistance. And however you want to do this, I hate to take the life out of this, but it just stands there as a symbol of the human struggle. So that's it again. That's in the class of what you call a narrative, a theme. Gamble does the same thing. This is I use this one because this is called the predicament, but it's man. But Gamble goes way out of town, sort of describing this little part of the predicament and that little part of the predicament, and the lines on the floor, and what is that? What's that part of the predicament? And then here's the dreams. So it's the man's dreams in gold here, and it's the fears and all those sorts of things. And so again, is it an allegory of man? Is it a I mean, I don't know if he wants it to become a symbol. Yeah. So what is man? This one actually is more purely symbolic in the sense that there's the womb figure, the female, the life, the grapes, and all that sort of stuff. But there's also the snake lurking here, and the bread of life, and all that sort of stuff. But this is the front piece to the Gamble's book, the Hound of Heaven, and or for that whole series of paintings, rather. And so this is, and I don't know who cut this out. I don't think this is painted on. I might be wrong, actually. Yeah, I've never seen the original of this. So is it painted on white? But it doesn't feel right. It feels like it's probably been trimmed out by somebody. But nevertheless, it gives you a nice read on the idea of Gamble's ideas of pattern, creating interesting patterns, just shape that makes silhouettes. And but yeah, so that begins. It's the beginning, or the beginning of life, and all those things. It begins to be a symbol, right? Or however you want to interpret that. But I want you to read this with me just for a second, because this is actually something that I've been saying to you for some time. And this is by Walter Pater. Now, Walter Pater probably is one of those guys who was living in and an exponent of and a promoter of that idea of the aesthete, and some people call it a hedonistic mindset, but in fact, the purpose of music and all those things, the purpose of it in a sense, and all the work we do, though, is you could say it's a kind of an attempt to bring pleasure, but it's an attempt to elevate the mind at the same time. But there's something in just the pursuit of unity, of order, like the garden making thing that is good for the soul, good for the mind. And so if you don't have to take it the wrong way, and though he got in sort of trouble for, but they would say misleading the youth. What was the name of this book? This book is called The Renaissance. It's actually a curious read, but it has a couple thoughts in it that I'd like to read. I'd like to make this point with you, because I've made it with you before without without a supporting document from anybody else. There's plenty of this writing that comes from painters, and this guy is not a painter. Exempt from the stress of thought and sentiment, which taxed so severely the resources of the generations of Florentine artists, those earlier Venetian painters, down to Carpaccio and the Bellini, seem never for a moment to have been tempted even to lose sight of the scope. I don't know if that says ever to lose sight of the scope of their art and its strictness. Now, you get that idea? The idea of the scope of their art and its strictness. You said, so the stress of thought and sentiment, the point, the subject matter of the Raphael ones, which taxed so severely the resources of the generation of the Florentine artists. Well, he said these guys don't even appear to have been tempted to lose sight of the scope of their art and its strictness, or to forget that painting must be, before all things, decorative. a thing for the eye, a space of color on the wall. So, and that's again, well, you'll see what I mean, but you'll find this sort of thought constantly if you follow through and don't make presumptions about the nature of painting. That what's it about? You know, the docent in the museum who wants the little children to raise their hands and tell me what it's about, as opposed to having the children raise their hand and ask you what the artist, what aesthetic is, or what order is in a picture, or any of those things, right? That's too bad, because children are fully capable of grasping that. So it's a kind of a talking down to children. I actually worked with some fifth grade kids once, and I was very appreciative of one comment one of the kids made when we were all done, and it was mostly about doing some drawings, but using perspective. And this one young man, and these are fifth graders, he said to me, "I really thank you for not talking down to us. You know, do that. Would you keep that in mind, you know, as you're working with especially with kids, but with anybody, you know, just talk to them on the level." I remember that scene in Nero Wolfe. Nero Wolfe is a character, a Rex Stout detective character, but he would make people sit down in a chair in front of him if they wanted to talk to him. And he says, I won't talk to people except on the level. And there's something about that, isn't there, in talking to people and thinking, you know, and communicating, always on the level. There's a bad thing in the air today about this talking down to people and demeaning others on a presumption that you're better, you know. And it's a bad place. It's not the place of the brother, the brotherhood of man. It doesn't fit, you know. This has to do with dominance of old kingdoms and aristocracies and things like that. Where am I going with this? So I'll back off. But but significant parts of this thought, and that section of that book by Walter Pater is about Giorgione. Studies in the Renaissance, studies in whatever, but it's a Renaissance. The book's called The Renaissance. So here's Giorgione, and then I'm showing you, and this is the musician in the background here, but this is where painting begins to do its own dance. And so the subject, you can see, is reduced down to, what is that? A couple naked ladies and guys playing musical instruments. So the theme here becomes rather beauty, right? If you follow me. And that musical element, you see it translated by doing into something significantly as music per se, you know, as you get to more and more of the visual, right? And you'll find that they begin, and this is that aesthetic group that then begins to be more and more involved in just the aesthetics for its own sake. The arts and crafts movement, and you know, the people like the Matthews, Arthur and Lucia Matthews. So now here you're just looking at that again. This is a Twachtman at the bottom and a Whistler at the top left, and then and again you're talking theme here. What's a theme? So you know, it's a landscape. So what is the theme? You know, distant buildings on water. You know, and the left two, and water theme with rocks, with the rocky coast in Maine on the right. But you can feel that it's something else, right? You can feel the music is finally beginning to really take over pictures. And that doesn't mean that artists weren't always putting it in, but as he said, that the Florentine War there was so much attention being forced to be paid to the subject that this wasn't as possible, right? But you can see that something has shifted here. And of course, Degas was part of it, and the Japanese were always part of it, rather, right? So I always give Japanese credit in these prints for actually being ahead of the whole thing, because they were doing these things way back. And of course, Vermeer was ahead of the whole thing too. Never misunderstand that. And I am talking about the idea of the interplay of visual elements being more important than the subject. So here's Degas taking a bunch of horsemen, and he's just got an excuse to play games with orange, you know, with reds into orange with warm tones. But it's not that he's without. I mean, look at the placement of these whites, though. I mean, you want to talk about just simply music, the interplay of the orange, the interplay, you know, and the spots, you know. But it's just this delight in it. So again, as I say, it's just we've gone back to the music idea. And now you could say just decorator. I think it was Degas who said he considered himself to be a decorator out of a job. So for what that's worth. But I think we all are actually, if we're not doing our job, we're definitely decorators out of a job, or not decorators at all, which is mean we're in some other job, we're mechanics of some sort. Again, so there you can see these just marvelously harmonious colors. So this is where you're seeing the idea of harmony is far more important than the subject. Yeah, it's a couple of dancers just getting ready to go on stage or something. Looks like maybe all lining up to come prancing in at this time of the Nutcracker Suite, maybe the Nutcracker ballet. We might appreciate that more, but you see what's happening here. You see the difference, right? So the domination of subject, and now we're getting to the point where the subject is secondary, but for sure, it's always there. You can't escape from it. So Mishra, I hope that's amusing to you and beneficial in some way. It sort of, in a sense, is the last thing I wanted to do, but it's a piece of what we do. And as I said, why would it be the last thing I want to do? I teach it rather when I talk about composition. You can't. By the way, this is a point I'll just make. You can't ignore where these humans are placed in relation to each other, or how big they are in relation to each other. You can't ignore that and have it not be a negative factor in your picture. In other words, you still have to compose the way they used to. You know, the orientation of these two figures in relation to each other, or all these other players in relation to each other, are as objects. You know, the horse in the foreground here, all these things as objects actually have to also play. So it's not like we can get out of that. The placement on the floor, you know, the arrangement, the feng shui, what I call the feng shui. You can't get out of that and still have a good picture. It doesn't just become purely visual elements, right? Dancing around in very nice places. It isn't, but it's a fascinating combination, and for you to sort out how to play that, you know, and how not to be wrong. So your job really, it's a funny way, as I said, in our field, you can't just think you're an impressionist and paint blobby, slobbery stuff. You actually have to be as knowledgeable as anybody, and more so from the past, you know, the idea of organizing objects per se as part of the design. So don't try to get out of it that easily, okay? And I doubt that most of you do. You recognize the complexity of this. I like that one comment from Degas. He says, oh, painting, oh, it's easy, at least when you know nothing about it. So, all right. Well, Happy New Year to all you folks. This isn't quite that far in yet, but this is the day after, 2 days after Christmas. I'd give you a Boxing Day present, but I hope you'll forgive me for taking a couple days off in there, but here we are back in trucking. Send in your questions, comments. Thank you again, Mary Jo, and for your nice contribution. And yeah, subscribe, do all those things. Please do share. We have just passed the 2,000 subscriber level, so I am absolutely planning. We're still holding out to do something, I think, on the 2nd. Which is just a few days away, live. So stay tuned. I'm hoping we can get something maybe on the board here for you to look at, more specific. All right, good. All right, take care. See you in the next one.